The day began like any other, the kind of morning that felt routine and harmless. The grocery store was humming with quiet life. The soft beeping of checkout scanners, the low chatter between shoppers, the squeak of cart wheels turning down clean, polished aisles. It was one of those places where nobody expects trouble. People were in their own worlds, focused on their lists, their thoughts, their small plans for the day. Somewhere between the produce section and the canned goods, an older man moved carefully, pushing his cart with the deliberate patience of someone who had seen harder days. His back was straight, though the years had left their mark. The patches on his jacket gave him away. A proud veteran, someone who had served his country and carried that quiet dignity everywhere he went. He paused now and then to read labels, moving with the steady rhythm of habit. There was nothing extraordinary about him to the strangers around him, but to anyone who looked closely, there was something unmistakable about the way he carried himself. The kind of calm that only comes from surviving storms most people can't imagine. His hands were a little unsteady when he reached for items on the top shelf, but he didn't ask for help. He never did. That kind of pride doesn't fade, not after what he's been through. Across the aisle, another man was standing. Younger, restless, maybe irritated about something that had nothing to do with the moment. His energy was sharp and loud, even in silence, the kind that makes people instinctively keep their distance. He kept glancing at his phone, muttering under his breath, visibly annoyed at whatever was playing out in his life. The veteran didn't pay him much mind at first. He had seen that kind of anger before, and he knew when to stay clear. But fate has a strange way of pulling two paths together, especially when they should have never crossed. As the veteran turned his cart to grab a loaf of bread, the younger man brushed past him, hard enough to jolt the cart sideways. The veteran froze, more surprised than hurt. He looked up and said something polite, something small, a quiet, "Watch it there, son." That was all it took. The man stopped, turned, and glared. The air shifted. The lightness of the store suddenly felt heavy, like a storm cloud rolling in. The tension was thick enough for the people nearby to feel it, though they pretended not to see. Nobody wants to get involved, not when anger like that is brewing. The younger man stepped closer, his voice low but sharp, full of the kind of disrespect that drips like poison. The veteran tried to defuse it, raising a hand, trying to move on. He'd seen worse confrontations in his life, and this was just another angry stranger, another moment he'd rather leave behind. But it didn't end there. The thug wasn't interested in peace. He was looking for someone to blame, someone to hit, someone who couldn't or wouldn't fight back. The blow came out of nowhere. A quick, violent punch that landed squarely across the veteran's face. The sound cracked through the quiet aisle, a sickening, hollow thud that froze everyone in place. The cart rattled, the bread fell to the floor, and the old man stumbled back against the shelves. For a second, the store went silent. The hum of the lights, the buzz of the coolers, even the distant music, all of it seemed to stop. The few shoppers nearby stood still, torn between shock and disbelief. Some reached for their phones, some whispered to each other, and others just stared, unable to comprehend what they'd seen. The man who threw the punch was breathing hard, his fists clenched, his face twisted with something ugly and bitter. The veteran slowly straightened, blood trickling from his lip, his jaw tight, his eyes clear. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't fight back. He just stood there, steady and quiet, while the younger man spat out words that didn't even register anymore. In that moment, the world seemed to shrink to that single aisle. The produce, the shelves, the carts, all of it became the background to something raw and cruel. The old man, who had faced war, who had seen real fear, now faced a kind of cowardice that cuts deeper than any wound. People wanted to look away, but they couldn't. Something about it felt wrong on a level that went beyond the violence. It was the imbalance, the disrespect, the audacity of striking someone who had already given everything he had for others. The veteran didn't say much after that. He wiped his lip, steadied himself, and reached for his phone, not out of anger, but with quiet purpose. The younger man sneered and turned to walk away, muttering under his breath. He didn't know what was coming next. Nobody did. The veteran simply stood there, breathing slow, the noise of the world coming back in pieces, the buzz of lights, the shuffle of footsteps, the whisper of shock still hanging in the air. The attack came without a word of warning. One moment, the aisle was quiet, and the next, chaos erupted with the force of something ugly and senseless. The veteran had barely lifted his eyes from his card when the younger man's fist connected. There was no hesitation, no build-up, just a raw act of aggression that seemed to come from nowhere. It wasn't about words or misunderstanding. It was about dominance, about cruelty, one man deciding to prove something by preying on someone he thought couldn't fight back. The punch landed hard enough to send the veteran stumbling sideways into the shelf. Cans clattered to the floor. A box of cereal burst open, scattering across the tile. The sound echoed down the aisle, sharp and shocking. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Every shopper froze mid-step, mid-sentence, unsure what they had just seen. The veteran steadied himself against the shelf, his hand gripping the metal edge to stay upright. His face showed more surprise than pain at first. It wasn't the physical blow that hit hardest. It was the disbelief that someone could lash out like that in a place so ordinary, so public. He had been through war zones, where danger was expected, where fear made sense. But here, in a grocery store on a normal afternoon, the violence made no sense at all. The man who hit him stood there, chest heaving, eyes wild, as if daring anyone to challenge him. He wasn't drunk or confused. He was angry in a way that felt deliberate, practiced, like he wanted to see someone smaller flinch. The veteran looked up at him, eyes clear and steady. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't curse. He didn't even reach for his face. He just stared back with the calm of someone who had seen worse monsters than this one. That kind of composure only made the attacker more furious. He stepped closer, his words turning cruel, sharp, filled with the kind of venom that's meant to humiliate. He mocked the old man's limp, his slow movements, his age. He laughed at the veteran's attempt to keep his balance. The veteran said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence often speaks louder than rage. But the silence only fed the attacker's need to provoke. A young mother nearby gasped, pulling her child behind her cart. An employee peered around the corner but didn't move forward. The moment was too unpredictable, too dangerous. Everyone was waiting for someone else to act, for authority to step in, for a voice to break the tension. But no one did. The air felt thick, heavy with disbelief and fear. The veteran finally took a slow breath, straightened, and adjusted his jacket. His movements were careful, deliberate, every muscle aching from the hit, but he refused to show weakness. That refusal enraged the thug even more. He shouted something obscene, his voice echoing through the store. The veteran didn't respond. He simply reached for the edge of his cart, righted it, and looked toward the end of the aisle as if he might just leave the moment behind. The attacker wasn't done. He shoved the cart, knocking it sideways again, the metal scraping loudly against the floor. The veteran stumbled but didn't fall. That single act of restraint, choosing not to strike back, seemed to draw a line between the two men that everyone could see. One represented everything steady, disciplined, earned through hardship. The other was chaos, blind and weak, hiding behind the illusion of power. A few shoppers started pulling out their phones now, recording from a distance, their hands trembling. The situation had crossed from confusion to something darkly real. The veteran's cheek was beginning to swell. A cut had opened just below his eye where the punch had landed, and a small streak of blood ran down toward his jaw. He wiped it away with the back of his hand and looked at the man in front of him, still saying nothing. His silence was its own kind of defiance. The attacker barked something about minding his space, about respect, twisting his own guilt into justification. The people around them could see what it was, an unprovoked attack, pure and simple, but no one wanted to draw his attention. The veteran didn't reach for a weapon or raise a fist. He simply stood his ground, breathing through the sting of the hit, his eyes steady, unflinching. Somewhere deep down, his training was keeping him in control. He had learned discipline the hard way, through battles where emotion could cost lives. He wasn't about to lose that control here. The store's fluorescent lights reflected off the polished floor, throwing long shadows around them. The man who had thrown the punch started pacing in small circles, muttering to himself, trying to convince the room that he was the one wronged. The people nearby could see through the act, but no one spoke. The sound of a phone dialing broke the tension for a moment. Someone was calling the police. Another person whispered to a cashier to lock the front door. The veteran finally bent to pick up the loaf of bread that had fallen. His movements were slow but deliberate. He didn't say a word to his attacker. There was no need. The man's actions had already spoken for him. Every pair of eyes in that store knew who he was now. The veteran's composure, his refusal to fight back, only deepened the silence around them. It wasn't weakness, it was something else entirely. A kind of strength that doesn't need to prove itself. The attacker scoffed, rolled his shoulders, and took a step back, unsure of what to do next. The shoppers remained still, caught between fear and fury, waiting for the moment to shift again, waiting to see what the old soldier would do next. The silence that followed the attack hung in the air like a thick fog, heavy and suffocating. The people around the aisle stood frozen, eyes wide, mouths half open, unsure whether to move, speak, or even breathe. A mother clutched her child close to her chest, whispering something the little one couldn't understand. A teenager who had been scrolling on his phone stopped mid-swipe, his hand trembling slightly as he lowered the screen. An elderly couple stood by the cereal display, their faces pale with disbelief. The store, once filled with the ordinary sounds of life, small talk, carts rolling, music humming overhead, had fallen completely still. It was the kind of silence that doesn't just happen, it's forced upon everyone by shock. The veteran, still standing where he'd been struck, seemed to carry the weight of that silence on his shoulders. His face was marked with the impact, a faint bruise already forming beneath his eye, but his posture remained straight. He didn't lash out, didn't shout, didn't crumble. He simply existed in that unbearable quiet, a calm figure in the middle of chaos that hadn't yet broken. Around him, the energy had shifted. Fear had taken hold, but so had something else. Tension so tight it could be felt like static in the air. People wanted to do something, anything, but nobody knew what the right move was. Some instinctively reached for their phones, fumbling with screens, torn between recording and calling for help. A young man near the end of the aisle whispered to a friend, his voice shaky. Should we stop him? The question hung unanswered. The attacker stood a few feet away, pacing in small, erratic movements, his breathing hard, his chest rising and falling fast. His hands were still balled into fists, his jaw set tight. There was something unstable in the way he shifted his weight, something that warned everyone not to get too close. A store employee peered around the corner, her name tag slightly crooked, eyes darting from the veteran to the man who had hit him. She looked terrified but forced herself to take a few steps forward. "Sir, please," she said, her voice trembling but polite. "Let's just calm down." The attacker whipped his head toward her, and she froze in place. He didn't need to say anything. The look in his eyes was enough. She took a small step back, hands up, trying to de-escalate without becoming the next target. The tension grew thicker with each passing second. Shoppers exchanged glances, each waiting for someone else to make the first move. The veteran didn't say a word. He was steady, breathing through the moment like he was back in a situation that demanded discipline over emotion. He'd seen panic before, felt it crawl under his skin in places far away from this grocery aisle, and he knew better than to let it control him. He knew that losing control only fed the chaos. His stillness began to have an effect on the room. People started looking at him, not the attacker. His calm presence, even bruised and bleeding, gave the crowd something to anchor to. The attacker noticed that too. He saw where everyone's eyes were turning, and it fueled his rage. He shouted, a mix of curses and accusations, trying to pull attention back to himself, to remind everyone that he was the one in control. But the sound only made the silence afterward even sharper. Nobody answered him. No one gave him the reaction he wanted. The veteran just looked at him, his gaze steady and unflinching, and that was worse than any insult could have been. The man's voice faltered for a moment. his words stumbling as he tried to maintain his dominance. Somewhere near the back of the store, the faint crackle of a radio could be heard. An employee was whispering into a walkie-talkie, probably calling for a manager or security. The store wasn't used to this kind of trouble. Most of the time, the biggest problems were misplaced carts or price disputes. Now there was real violence in their aisles, and nobody was equipped to handle it. A few more shoppers started backing away slowly, pulling their carts with them, trying not to draw attention. The scene had a fragile balance to it. One wrong move could send everything spiraling. The veteran stayed rooted in place, one hand resting lightly on his cart. He didn't look scared, but he didn't look angry either. He looked focused, the way someone does when they're assessing a situation. Every breath was measured. His eyes flicked briefly toward the end of the aisle, as if counting exits, judging distances, noting the faces of the people around him. Old instincts were surfacing: situational awareness, threat assessment, calm under pressure. It wasn't training he'd ever expected to use again, certainly not here, but it came back to him like muscle memory. The attacker kept pacing, muttering to himself, his voice growing quieter now. The crowd's fear was turning into something else, collective disbelief mixed with a slow-burning anger. The injustice of it all was settling in. Whispers started to move through the store, soft but growing. "He hit that old man," someone said. "He's a veteran," another voice added. The words carried weight. They spread quickly, building a kind of moral tension that thickened the air even more. The veteran blinked once, a slow, steady motion. He didn't respond to the whispers. He didn't acknowledge the crowd. His focus was entirely on the man who had hit him, watching him the way a soldier watches an unpredictable opponent. Waiting, ready, patient. Around them, the grocery store no longer felt like a safe, ordinary place. The lights felt too bright. The space between shelves felt too narrow. Every sound was amplified. The hum of a cooler, the faint beeping from the checkout lanes in the distance, the nervous shuffle of a shoe on tile. The world had narrowed to this aisle, this confrontation, this unspoken tension that refused to break. The veteran finally moved, his hand steady as he reached into the pocket of his jacket. The attacker's eyes flicked toward the motion, tense and ready for a reaction. But all the veteran pulled out was his phone. The movement was slow, deliberate, without a trace of fear. His fingers trembled only slightly as he unlocked the screen and pressed a familiar number. The crowd around him stayed quiet, still caught in the tight grip of uncertainty. Nobody knew who he was calling. The veteran raised the phone to his ear, his face calm, the faintest trace of blood still on his lip. He spoke softly, his tone even, the kind of voice that doesn't panic, doesn't shout. It simply commands attention through composure. On the other end of the line, the person who answered must have recognized his voice instantly. The veteran's son had grown up hearing that voice, the tone that came with experience, authority, and a kind of strength that doesn't need to explain itself. Whatever the veteran said in those few quiet seconds wasn't long, but it carried weight. A few words, clear and calm, enough to tell his son something was wrong. He didn't ask for help. He didn't have to. The pause on the other end of the line said everything. The son's voice came through, low and sharp, focused. There was no hesitation, no wasted time. The connection between father and son didn't need explanation. The veteran ended the call, slid the phone back into his pocket, and exhaled slowly. The attacker scoffed, unaware of what that simple call had set in motion. He took a step closer, sneering as if the phone call had been a sign of weakness. The veteran didn't react. He simply adjusted his stance, shifting his weight slightly, as if preparing for whatever came next. The man continued to mutter under his breath, his voice dripping with contempt. He thought he had control, thought he had humiliated the old man in front of everyone, thought that punch had made him powerful. The crowd still kept their distance, watching, waiting. A few whispered questions rippled through them. Who had he called? Was it the police? A friend? The truth was far beyond what anyone in that store could have imagined. A few miles away, a phone was being set down on a table. A young man in uniform straightened, his jaw tight, his expression turning to stone. His father's voice had said just enough. No drama, no panic. just a message delivered with the quiet weight of experience. It was all he needed to hear. The veteran's son was a Marine, trained to respond to crisis, trained to act with precision and control. But this wasn't just duty anymore, it was personal. He signaled to a few others nearby, men who had served alongside him, brothers bound by more than just uniform. They didn't ask questions. They didn't need to. When one of their own was in trouble, especially family, they moved. Back in the grocery store, time felt slower. The veterans stood still, the crowd whispering in low voices, some still holding their phones uncertainly. The attacker's bravado was starting to waver, just a little. Maybe it was the way the veteran refused to react, or maybe it was the way the tension in the room no longer seemed to revolve around him. He paced again, muttering, pretending not to care, but his movements had lost their rhythm. The people around him were beginning to shift, their silence heavier, their glances sharper. The calm before something none of them could yet define. Outside, the world went on as usual. Cars passing by, the faint hum of traffic, the sound of a breeze rustling through the parking lot. But somewhere between that noise, another kind of movement began. Vehicles changing course, tires cutting through lanes faster than usual, voices over radios coordinating without hesitation. The Marine's phone had set off a chain reaction. Calls were made, directions given, messages passed quietly but efficiently. In less than a minute, word had spread among the small circle of men who always answered when one of their own needed backup. Inside, the veteran hadn't moved more than an inch. His eyes stayed locked on the man in front of him, watching every twitch, every breath. The pain from the punch was dull now, replaced by a steady clarity. He could almost feel the seconds ticking by, slow but certain. He knew his son well enough to know that help was already moving. He didn't have to say a word or raise his voice. The knowledge of that connection was enough to steady his breathing, enough to keep him standing tall in front of a man who thrived on intimidation. The shoppers started to sense it too, though they couldn't explain why. Something about the atmosphere had shifted again. It wasn't fear anymore, it was anticipation. The quiet had a different tone now, as if the air itself knew change was coming. The attacker laughed nervously, trying to keep control of the situation, trying to convince himself he still held the upper hand. But there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes, a trace of unease he couldn't quite shake. The veteran didn't respond. His phone stayed silent, but the echo of that brief call lingered in the air. Minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. The veteran didn't need to look at his watch to know it hadn't been long since he made the call. 7 minutes could feel like forever in a moment like this, but he knew from experience that 7 minutes could also change everything. The crowd shifted slightly, drawn toward the aisle, yet careful to keep their distance. Nobody wanted to speak too loudly. Nobody wanted to move too fast. The attacker's voice grew quieter, his arrogance slowly peeling away under the weight of something unseen. The veteran stood still, eyes sharp, waiting, knowing exactly what was on its way. The minutes that followed were slow and stretched thin, the kind of silence that doesn't just fill a room but presses against every wall. The grocery store had returned to a strange rhythm, small movements, whispers, the soft hum of the refrigeration units, but everyone was still on edge. The veteran stood steady near the middle of the aisle, his breathing even, his composure untouched. He didn't check his phone, didn't move, didn't speak. The attacker was starting to lose his swagger. His voice, once loud and commanding, had dwindled to mutters. He kept glancing toward the door, pacing in small steps, his eyes flicking to the people who wouldn't meet his gaze. The tension hadn't lifted, it had shifted. The fear that once belonged to the shoppers was now settling on him. Then, faintly at first, came the sound of engines outside. Not the usual hum of cars rolling by, but something different, quick, purposeful, unified. Tires pressed against asphalt, stopping sharply in front of the store. The glass doors at the entrance reflected flashes of movement, shadows cutting across the light. A few heads turned toward the sound, uncertain of what was happening. The attacker noticed too. His pacing stopped, his head snapping toward the front of the store. The veteran didn't move, his eyes steady, his hands resting calmly on the handle of his cart. The automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss, and the atmosphere inside the grocery store changed instantly. The first Marine stepped in, posture straight, presence undeniable. He wasn't wearing full uniform, but everything about him spoke of discipline. The way he moved, the way his eyes swept across the space in one smooth motion, the way his body carried silent authority. Behind him, others followed, 3, then 5, then more. Each one entered with the same calm, controlled energy. They weren't loud, they weren't rushing, but they filled the space completely. The customers near the front instinctively stepped aside, parting to make room. The air grew thick again, charged not with fear this time, but with something powerful, almost electric. The attacker froze, halfway between confusion and disbelief. He took a small step back, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. These weren't police officers, not mall security, not ordinary men. Their presence alone shifted the balance of the entire room. One of them looked directly at the veteran, their eyes locking in instant recognition. No words were exchanged, but there was understanding there, deep and silent. It was the son, his stance, his eyes, his steady calm, identical to his father's. He didn't need to ask what had happened. One glance told him everything. The Marines spread out with quiet precision, no shouting, no chaos. Their movements were measured, practiced. One stayed near the front entrance, another near the side aisle. 2 more flanked the shelves where the attacker stood. The shoppers watched in stunned silence. Even the smallest sounds, the rustle of a shopping bag, the creak of a cart wheel, felt too loud in that moment. The attacker's face shifted from arrogance to uncertainty, then to fear. His hands, still clenched into fists a few minutes ago, started to loosen. He looked around, searching for a way out, but every path seemed closed. The veteran didn't speak. He simply watched as his son took a slow step forward. The distance between them closed in seconds, though neither man rushed. The son stopped beside his father, standing shoulder to shoulder, the resemblance between them striking. Same stance, same quiet strength. He didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten. The silence around them said enough. The attacker took another step back, bumping into a display of canned goods. The clatter of metal breaking the quiet made him flinch. One of the Marines near the front door made a small gesture, and the others responded without a word. It wasn't aggression, it was control. The kind of control that comes from years of training and shared understanding. The shoppers, who had once been frozen in fear, began to relax slightly, sensing that the danger was no longer theirs to carry. The balance had shifted completely. The man who had thrown a punch now found himself surrounded by a silent wall of strength that made his earlier rage look pitiful and small. The attacker stammered something, his words slipping over themselves, excuses tangled in panic. Nobody answered. The Marines stood still, eyes locked on him, their expressions unreadable. The veteran's son finally spoke, his voice low and steady, every syllable carrying authority. Whatever he said wasn't loud enough for everyone to hear, but it cut through the tension like a blade. The attacker froze again, shoulders tense, hands twitching nervously. There was no more fight left in him. His earlier confidence had drained away, leaving only fear and the realization that he had made a mistake he could never take back. Outside, more vehicles had arrived. Unmarked, quiet, each one parked in tight formation. Through the glass, movement was visible, shadows shifting along the perimeter of the store. The Marines weren't there for violence. They were there for presence. The kind of presence that stops a situation before it can spiral. The kind of presence that reminds everyone that some lines should never be crossed. The veteran stood silently beside his son, eyes calm, hands still steady. He hadn't moved much since the moment he was struck, but everything around him had changed. The crowd that had once looked at him with pity now looked at him with respect. The air felt charged, alive with a strange mix of fear and awe. The attacker's breathing had turned shallow, his voice gone. He glanced toward the exit, but the Marines didn't need to block it. He wasn't going anywhere. The stillness that followed was thicker than before, but this time it carried a different kind of weight. It was no longer fear holding the store in place. It was consequence. The attacker's confidence broke the moment reality set in. The silence in the store felt heavier than ever, the kind that wraps around a man when he realizes there's nowhere left to run. He looked around, wild-eyed, his breath quickening as he tried to piece together a way out. But every direction led to the same truth. He was surrounded. The Marines didn't speak, didn't move with aggression. Their stillness was more intimidating than any weapon could have been. The man's bravado, the sneer he'd carried since the moment he threw that punch, had drained from his face completely. What remained was a shallow, panicked expression, like someone waking up from a bad dream and realizing it was real. The veteran stood where he always had, his hands resting lightly on the cart handle. His bruised face caught the harsh light of the store, the small cut on his lip drying dark against his skin. He didn't need to say a word. His silence had already spoken louder than anything else in that store. He wasn't a victim anymore, and he hadn't been one for a second after the call. The balance of power had shifted completely, and everyone in that store could feel it. The attacker's arrogance had collapsed into fear. The crowd, once frozen in uncertainty, was now united by something else: justice, raw and visible. The veteran's son took a small step forward, his boots firm against the tile. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten or posture. His tone was calm, but carried the weight of command that couldn't be ignored. His words were short, precise, a statement rather than a warning. The attacker tried to speak back, stumbled over his own words, the sound weak and uncertain. His body was tense, caught between fight and flight, but his mind already knew neither would work. The Marines didn't advance, didn't close in. They simply stood as a wall of presence, and that alone was enough. A store employee, still standing near the end of the aisle, whispered into a phone, likely confirming that law enforcement was on the way. The situation was contained, but the air still buzzed with tension. The people watching from a distance began to exhale for the first time in what felt like forever. The fear that had held them quiet started to fade, replaced by awe. They weren't seeing violence. They were seeing consequence unfold in real time. It was something raw and rare in a world where people often got away with cruelty. The attacker's breathing had turned into shallow gasps, his hands twitching at his sides as if unsure whether to raise them or not. The veteran's son's gaze didn't waver. It wasn't rage that burned behind his eyes, it was principle. He wasn't there to hurt anyone. He was there to make sure his father's dignity wasn't something anyone could touch. The Marines around him mirrored that focus. Their discipline spoke volumes about the kind of bond that doesn't need words, a loyalty that goes beyond family and into brotherhood. They stood at ease but alert, watching the man who had once thought he could take advantage of someone weaker. The crowd saw the difference between real power and false bravado, and that contrast hit hard. Outside, the faint wail of approaching sirens began to blend with the quiet hum of the parking lot. The lights from police vehicles flickered against the windows, flashing blue and red across the aisles. The Marines didn't flinch or step back. They had already done their part. They'd drawn the line, kept the peace, restored balance. When the first officers entered, the store manager pointed immediately toward the aisle. The police slowed as they approached, their eyes sweeping over the group of men standing still, the veteran at the center, and the attacker frozen in place. It didn't take long for them to understand who was who. The officers moved in smoothly, their tone professional, controlled. The Marines stepped aside without a word, creating space but maintaining their quiet presence. The attacker raised his hands, his voice trembling as he tried to talk his way out of it, claiming it was a misunderstanding, that the old man had provoked him. But the words sounded hollow in the face of what everyone had witnessed. There were phones with recordings, witnesses still in shock, and a veteran standing silently, his composure unbroken. The truth didn't need defending. It was written all over the scene. One officer gently placed a hand on the veteran's shoulder, checking if he was injured. He nodded once, slowly, still refusing to play the victim. The Marine's son stayed close, his expression unreadable, his focus on the man being led toward the exit. The attacker's voice had gone quiet now. His face was pale, his movements jerky as the officers guided him out. The crowd followed the motion with their eyes, their expressions a mix of anger and relief. The sound of the handcuffs locking echoed softly through the aisle. The Marines didn't celebrate or speak. They stood still until the last officer had left with the attacker. Only then did the veteran's son look at his father. For a long moment, they just stood there, a silent exchange between two men who didn't need words to understand what had been said and done. The veteran gave a small nod, and his son returned it. Around them, the tension in the store began to break apart. People started moving again, carts rolling, whispers turning into conversations. The ordinary sounds of life came back slowly, blending with the faint crackle of radios and the last flickers of police lights outside. The veteran adjusted his jacket, his movements steady. The Marines quietly stepped back toward the entrance, their boots making almost no sound on the tile. The crowd parted again, giving them room as they left. The shoppers watched them go, eyes following the quiet, disciplined exit. The grocery store began to feel normal again, though everyone inside knew they'd just witnessed something that would linger for a long time. The veteran stayed for a moment longer, standing tall under the fluorescent lights, his cart beside him, surrounded by the echoes of a moment that had revealed the difference between cruelty and strength.